Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiaragana AA Wash Process Kenya from Goût & Co. And there's the bag right there. And Goût & Co, based out of Chengdu, China. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Gara, a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that we picked that coffee up from Airworks as part of their September coffee drop. And I'd initially added a different Kenyan coffee to that order. However, that coffee was no longer available by the time Airworks placed their wholesale order. So I told Airworks to swap it out for one of their other Kenyan coffees. And this is the one that they selected. So it'll be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 49. And recipe we went with for the coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, once again, it's in line with our previous experiences with this coffee roaster, which we described as being one of the lighter roasted coffee roasters that we've had from Airworks up to this point. And even then, I would say that this is one of the lighter roasting Asian coffee roasters that we've reviewed on this channel as well. All to say that this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 23, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the coffee itself was pretty straightforward for what you'd expect for a Kenyan coffee, offering bright red berry forward aspects to it, with a slightly lower than average savoriness also present, sweetness lower than the expectations as well, as the coffee felt like it was relatively fresh. And that's the biggest takeaway I had from this first experience, was that this coffee probably still needed a little bit more time for it to open up. Day 26 through the Chemex, and it's offering plenty of similarities to the initial experience, with a slight bit more sweetness and intensity this time around, skewing a bit more on the savory tea aspects, with the focus remaining on the tart berries otherwise. We move on to day 29 as we opted for the April brewer, and I continue to have the sentiment that the coffee probably needs a little bit more time to open up, as it's still relatively tame in terms of the sweetness and intensity, rather focusing on the Kenyan-like aspects, most specifically in terms of the red berry aspects yet again. So we move on to day 32 as we opted for the V60 with some higher temperatures and a more fine grind. And the coffee itself continues to feel slightly generic and straightforward for a wash processed Kenyan coffee, as it's offering a traditional tart berry forward base. But I was still struggling to find an overly defining factor of this one, mostly because it's been about average on every level that I could expect for a wash processed Kenyan coffee, with a slightly toned down sweetness and intensity otherwise. So it's all to say it's been just very Kenyan forward. Day 35 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this was the best it had been to this point, even though it's still offering a very straightforward Kenyan experience. This is the first time I felt a fair bit of the listed brown sugar sweetness in the finish. Very forward otherwise, but once again, pretty straightforward. A lot of these notes up to this point have been pretty consistent. As we move on to day 38, opting for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it was not quite as good as some of the other recent days we've had of this one. A slight bit more of a spiced tea-like quality, with a bit more savoriness overall, this time skewing a little bit more on the, we'll say, vegetable savory side of things. Expectedly bright with tartness to the fruits and a bit of red florality as well. Day 41 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and once again, it's the best it's been to this point, with really nice sweetness to the red berries and plenty of the listed brown sugar sweetness. Bright, more intense, cleaner, and sweeter in general, so I was definitely finding a pretty stark contrast between the two brew methods at this time. So on day 44, we did opt for the Chemex one last time, and it does continue to remain best through this brew method, as it's relatively straightforward for a Kenyan coffee, this time with a little bit less of the savoriness in place of a slightly sweeter and cleaner cup. Now there's a slight lime and plum to go with the bright tart berry aspects of this one. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish and the acidity to level 4. And the main reason we're starting with those is because I've always said, if a Kenyan coffee, washed Kenyan coffee, isn't scoring a level 4 with those, then something went horribly wrong. But there's not really too much to say on both those. It has that lingering, we'll actually say brown sugar finish, which does give this one a little bit of depth, as opposed to maybe being overly bright in terms of that finish, skewing heavily on those red berry aspects. So I've liked that part about the finish of this coffee. Acidity, though, I do find it kind of interesting. That's the one thing that they do have on their tasting wheel. They score a level 5, and I kind of thought about that, and I said, I can see that. In hindsight, when I really think about it, Kenyan coffees, for the most part, do score that level 5 in terms of the brightness. I'm just used to modern day coffees, most specifically a lot of the heavier processed coffees, having out of whack acidity, and as a result, I think that's kind of changed the bar and expectation for that level 4 in terms of acidity. A little bit of a tangent, but that's kind of the reason I score a lot of these coffees at the level 4, these Kenyan coffees, because I've had coffees that have kind of skewed even more heavily in terms of the brightness of them. So level 4 for me, level 5 for them, still a very bright coffee nonetheless. Sweetness level 4, and I do have to say, especially towards the end, especially with the brew method that we opted for, this one was pretty sweet. A lot of these sweeter brown sugar aspects of it. I wouldn't necessarily say it was an overly high level 4. It's probably on the slightly lower side to middle side of that level 4, but even then, still sweeter than the average Kenyan coffee in general. Florally, level 4. And usually I associate a lot of the red floral tones to go along with Kenyan coffees. Most notably, always seem to highlight the hibiscus factor. I think that they do have something along the lines of a hawthorn listed on here, so just a little different. Nonetheless, I would say that that kind of rhubarb feel to it definitely present within this one. Berry fruit, level 4, and plenty of the tart, bright berry aspects present within this one right from the onset. And a very consistent note, they have raspberry listed on here. I think that they have another like cranberry note listed on here. Yeah, definitely both slightly more tart. Red fruits, even currants, you could definitely see a fair bit of that within this coffee as well, as it certainly offered a very red theme throughout the entirety of it. And then we will go to the very important level 4, that cleanliness. And I saved that one for last because it's always a really important discussion point, especially when it comes to Kenyan coffees, because this one was lacking the very strong savory aspects. And it is interesting, I say a lot, that the Chemex can take and it can give. So in some cases, it can kind of strip away some of the more positive aspects, but at the same time, it can strip away some of the less desirable aspects. And in this case, it seems to take away a fair bit of the more vegetal savory qualities of this one, which really seemed to help this coffee in general. So I was very happy with it scoring at that level 4, as that's always a really good sign for a Kenyan coffee. Couple of level 3s. We will start with the citrus fruit, level 3. And yes, it has that lime-like aspect that I mentioned briefly, as it definitely did give this coffee a little bit more depth. As pretty early on, I was saying this is just very straightforward for a Kenyan coffee, but towards the end, I'm like, okay, we're experiencing a few more things, including the stone fruit, which also scored there at that level 3 mark. That's still a darker stone fruit aspect. A little bit more of the plums were also present within this one, giving it, once again, some more fruit depth to this coffee. Caramel level 3, that's certainly the brown sugar note that they have listed on here. It definitely had a little bit more of a sugary, candied feel to it, which definitely gave it a little bit more of a boost in terms of the overall sweetness. Body level 3, fully expected. Even with the Chemex, this one definitely had a fair bit of texture to it. And given that we were making this tasting with the Gara, that might have helped it a little bit too, given that that one was notably lighter bodied than this one. So level 3 is where we opted for it. Final thing worth discussing, the savoriness there at the level 2 mark. And interestingly enough, that's a little bit more on the tea-like side of things. So even then, I could say that there's a slight bit of that Kenyan-like savoriness to it, that vegetal quality. Even with the Chemex, even with it stripping away the majority of it, it's still relatively toned down to the majority of Kenyan coffees. So I'm very happy with that scoring there at that level 2. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. The Gara was very straightforward for a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, and I do have to say that for the most part, this one was pretty straightforward for a wash-processed Kenyan coffee. And if you're curious what I had picked out originally when we were picking one of the Kenyan coffees from Goût & Co., it was actually just one of their SL28, SL34 coffees, because I do find it more interesting reviewing coffees that are just the SL varietals. This one right here is a little bit more of a field blend, which at times can be even better and more impressive than just the SL28, SL34 coffees, but I felt like that would have made for a little bit more interesting of a review. This one had really nice parts of it, but for the most part, I just kind of am left wondering if maybe that coffee would have been something a little bit more interesting to discuss, because this one was just very Kenyan-like right from the start. It offered plenty of Kenyan-like aspects, and then even towards the end, it continued to remain that way. I was able to get this coffee to a point where it's a little bit more in line with my own preferences as far as Kenyan coffees go. Even then, it's just very true to the experiences and expectations that you would have for a Kenyan coffee. which does take me into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I think that this one does skew a little bit more in the Kenyan type of drinker that I am, which is to say it does offer a little bit more sweetness. It does offer a little bit more of those candied aspects. It does at times give you some additional fruit qualities as opposed to the very direct, bright, super savory red fruit qualities that can be present within the Kenyan coffees in general. So that's to say that this one just offers something a little different while at the same time maintaining some really nice traditionality, all within a lighter profile in coffee. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiaragana AA Wash Processed Kenya from Goût & Co. Thank you for watching.